I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of what we're going to cover today, and then we're going to move into our fuller introduction of aorta and our work. So today is part 2 of our Multiply and Mobilize series, where we're really specifically focusing on divide and conquer as a strategy that's being used by elites over hundreds of years to keep us from being able to effectively organize together for a more transformative, more liberated society and a truly democratic society, which is part of what we are agitating for. This second webinar will be a little bit different than the first, in that this one is much more about helping us understand, contextualize and understand some of what's happening in this political moment, but not just what's happening in terms of what the meaning of the Trump power and the strategies that they're doing, but all that's happening within our movements. Part of the work that we're going to be doing today will be about contextualizing a lot of what's happening within social justice and activist movements for liberation within a broader view of how social movements work. So for those of you who are really excited about understanding how social movements work and how we win, this webinar is for you. And so we're hopeful that this will both feel like a total movement nerd fest, and will also give you some really concrete information about where you are and in terms of your particular role within movement work and your organization's role or the particular part of the movement that you occupy. That it'll give you some information about that, but it'll also give you some hopeful energy, we think, because you'll be able to sort of see the work that's happening right now within this longer view. So we're going to do another intro of ourselves. Just the last time, not everyone who was here was a part of the webinar, and you might have some more questions about just who is aorta, why are we doing this? Then we're going to do an overview of the system's strategies, and we'll explain more about what we mean by the system in a minute. What are the strategies seeing the Trump administration use? And then we're going to introduce 2 different tools for understanding movement building work. One is called Building Power. It comes from Project South. And the other is called The 8 Stages of Movement Building. That was initially published in a book called Doing Democracy. And we're going to actually do an interesting thing. We're going to map specific movements onto this movement building tool so that you can actually see in real time what we're talking about. And then we'll introduce some lessons for movement action planning in relationship to those tools that we've just shared. There will be an opportunity for Q&A, but it won't be really until the end, towards the end of the webinar, so just hold steady, know that. One of the things that we're inviting for folks who were a part of the last webinar experience, we know that some folks found the combination of watching the webinar presentation, trying to keep track of the presentations that the guests were making via video, and the chat box and all of that stuff. Some folks found that to be really overwhelming, and that makes a lot of sense to us. And so the invitation is that if you find that trying to follow what's happening in the chat box is too overwhelming, feel free to close it. You don't actually have to keep track of it. One of the things that we are going to do at the end of this webinar is copy and paste everything in the chat box and cull some of the core highlights and lessons that we are synthesizing out of these conversations that we're having. So that will be something that will be shared back to everybody, whether or not you were in the webinar. Okay, all right, let's move on to introducing aorta.
Megan just said thank you, thank you, thank you. And that was a thank you that we heard from a lot of participants last time, that all of the brilliance y'all put into the chat box was something people appreciated hearing from each other. So think of it like our attempt at creating a more popular education style space where we're really valuing the learnings in the whole group, and that we're all contributing to the learning process.
Mm-hmm. All right, so Manju, would you like to intro aorta?
I'd be delighted to. So aorta is a worker-owned cooperative, which means that all of the workers co-own the business and help with democratic decision-making. We are devoted to strengthening movements for social justice and a solidarity economy, an economy that's based on people having control over the functions in their own lives, and creating democratic workplaces all over the place that are cooperating with each other. What we do is we expand the capacity of cooperative, collective, and community-based projects through education, training, and planning. We work with other cooperatives, with nonprofit organizations, with grassroots organizations, networks, alliances, academic institutions, unions, small businesses, and we work with groups of all sizes, from like tiny collective houses to national or international scale groups. We base our work on an intersectional approach to liberation because we believe that true change requires uprooting all systems of oppression. And if you tuned in on the last call, you remember that we talked about intersectionality as a concept that is about understanding the ways that oppressions interlock and the ways that that people live experiencing multiple forms of oppression and multiple forms of liberation simultaneously in their bodies, and that intersectional thinking that comes out of Black feminism, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, is part of what grounds our analysis about how to win change.
Awesome. And maybe another good thing would be for each of us to introduce ourselves. So there are 4 of us who will be presenting today. And so we can each just share a name and where we're coming from. My name is Autumn Brown, and I live in rural Minnesota. And you might notice how rurally I live based on my internet connection. Hopefully it will work. And if it doesn't, feel free to give feedback into the chat box or in the Q&A box if you are experiencing any kind of technical difficulties.
My name is Mark, and I am in Berkeley, California. And yeah, a IORTA owner, member. And I'll be chipping in a little bit today, mostly watching and admiring my comrades.
My name is Manju, and I'm hailing from Durham, North Carolina.
And I'm Jenna. I'm in Southwest Philadelphia right now. I'm really happy to be here.
So what are we seeing? We're recognizing in this political moment systems of social organization are reorganizing to stay relevant and powerful. We're witnessing white supremacy reorganizing in response to destabilizations in capitalism. We are the ones who are destabilizing capitalism, and we are making progressive social movements wins, and we're seeing how the establishment, how the power holders are reorganizing in response to that. And we're going to be going really deep into this idea today. We're noticing in this moment how right-wing populism is on the rise, and that is a counter-progressive political movement that emerges whenever systems are under stress. And the ways that right-wing populism are surfacing are not okay, but they're also not new. And so we have the resource of history to be able to help us inform how to respond in this moment most effectively.
Awesome. Thank you, Manju. So one of the things that we wanted to do today, before we jump into our tools for understanding social movements, is talk a little bit about some of the specific strategies that we're seeing being utilized at the federal and state level. And one of the ways that we wanted to frame this is understanding that that the administration is using really specific strategies, and then they also have narratives that mask what the strategies are actually aimed to do. And then there are particular tactics that are utilized both at the federal, state, and local level to try to force that strategy towards a win. One of the things that I like to lift up that my sister Adrienne talks about all the time is the fact that, like, we often say strategy as though being strategic is a great thing, and we forget that strategy in and of itself is it's neither good nor bad. It just is. And so we have to sort of operate from the understanding that they have a strategy, they're deploying their strategy, and strategy as the concept is very much a militarized term, right? And so we have to have a counter strategy, but in order to counter strategy as a movement, we have to really deeply understand what their strategies are. And it's important to also deeply understand the depth and breadth of their thinking. In terms of the particular type of world that they're trying to build, right? That they also have an end game in mind that's counter-liberatory. So we're going to introduce 4 strategies, the narratives that uphold them, and some of the tactics that we're witnessing. The first strategy is prioritizing white nationalism. And the narrative that's being used to uphold this strategy is the narrative of America First. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about the America First narrative is that the masking language there is the use of the term America as sort of a catch-all, as though what's being talked is anyone as an American citizenship, prioritized by this student. And that there's that sort of, one of the ways that that's being popularly talked about in the mainstream media is this idea that we're moving back towards a more isolationist American global policy and a nationalist American global policy. But one of the interesting things that we've seen just in the first 100 days of the Trump presidency is the ways in which the administration's own activities and choices are undermining the idea that America First is actually about American citizens, and undermining the idea that America First is actually about an isolationist global policy, right? Take the bombing of the Syrian air base, and the threats to go to war with North Korea as like perfect examples of where it really reveals that narrative that this is putting America becoming more isolationist. That in reality, First is talking about a particular subset of Americans, and a particular advancing this idea that there are some people who are really truly American, and then there's all the rest of the people who are takers, who are really trying to get what Americans are supposed to deservedly have. And so we're really seeing that commitment to white nationalism and white supremacist ideology being advanced, both in the narratives that are being shared at the federal level, in terms of every time we see a soundbite from what comes out of our press secretary's mouth in the federal office. I mean, it's just the talking points are very clearly about advancing a white supremacist ideology. We tend to think of it as, he's so stupid, can't believe he's saying these things, but really these are talking points, right? They're all approved talking points by the administration, including the ones that are basically Holocaust denying talking points. And so some of the particular tactics that we're seeing include the travel ban, the attempted travel ban on people traveling from Muslim majority countries, the threats to punish sanctuary cities for being unwilling to go along with the policy of terrorizing immigrants, a drastic uptick in deportations, basically leveraging the massive system that was put in place under the Obama administration. They're really using that system to their advantage now, and also shifting towards a strategy of people being able to make decisions on a case-by-case basis about whether or not someone's going to be deported. And I think we all know what that means. Right, and then these bombastic threats to go to war with North Korea. And just a few examples of the ways in which we see these tactics being deployed that are all about centering a particular ideology around who is American, and what does it mean to be an American. Jenna, is there anything you want to add to that? Okay. So the next strategy that we want to use this strategy that's about privatizing public entities. And truly that's about a massive transference of wealth to people who already have an extreme amount of wealth. And that theft of wealth, the theft of generated by other people's labor it's a hallmark of capitalism as an economic practice. And what we're seeing is sort of a recommitment to, as much as we can use the engines of government to continue that transference of wealth, we are going to do that. The narrative, of course, is we're rebuilding America, that through this privatization and transference of wealth to people who are already wealthy and already have amassed these really large fortunes and already control an enormous amount of our economic functioning, through that process and by trusting their leadership, we will rebuild America. Some of the particular tactics that we're witnessing include the erosion of the Environmental Protection Agency and overall the threat to erode as much business as possible. The further privatization of schools, the attempt to further privatize healthcare. And then there's this recent round of corporate tax cuts or proposed corporate tax cuts that are just further indicators of this desire to really do this wealth transfer. Jenna, I don't know if you wanted to say anything specific about the corporate tax cuts. I know that you were tracking that more closely.
It's just a bummer. No, just in the last couple of days, that's been a news item that corporations are supposedly supposed to pay 35% in tax, which is often untrue in many loopholes. And Trump has proposed and made movement in the last day or two on lowering that number to 15%, which when this is targeting these really top level corporations, that's moving a really substantial amount of wealth. It's refunneling and redirecting a really, really significant amount of wealth, despite all the loopholes and ways that corporations weren't actually paying that 35% tax previously.
Exactly. Thank you for clarifying that.
And it's that wealth transfer that I think makes it so important to Aorta, that we are not just fighting social justice struggles, but that we're simultaneously building a solidarity economy. Yes,
exactly. And one of the reasons why we are a co-op, right, and why we center working with cooperatives is that we really understand the cooperation movement as being a pathway out of a capitalist system, right? That we understand that it's not enough to just say we're going to smash the state. We have to have a dual power approach to how we're actually doing our work, that we actually have to be building these alternative institutions, building these alternative economic processes, so that we have a place for all that capital to go. And we really understand cooperation as a practice, as a pathway out of these extremely brutal practices and historically brutal practices that keep people poor and without access to basic needs. All right, so this next strategy that we want to uplift is the strategy of equating right-wing Christianity with America. This is very to this idea, but the idea that that there's a particular religious practice more corely identified being an American than any other religious practice. Interestingly, the narrative that's upholding this is this narrative of religious freedom, that actually any attempts that are being made for communities that historically have been oppressed, particularly by religious practices, any attempt that those communities are making to have more rights or have more full freedoms within our democratic society are then mapped as a threat to religious freedom, as though the attack is on the church itself or on these church communities. And then there's this twin narrative that Islam specifically as a religion is anti-freedom, that it's like an enemy of freedom, it's an enemy of democratic societies. And so not only, so it's this, the narratives themselves are really interesting in terms of how they work together, because in so many ways they really are authentically counterposed to each other, and yet they're being advanced at the same time, right? That partly this is about religious freedom, but also Islam is bad. and people who practice Islam do not believe in freedom in the same way that we do, quote unquote. So those are some of the narratives that are being used to advance this overall strategy that's really about saying we are a Christian nation. That's who we are as Americans. And we're fighting to defend that, right? And so some of the tactics that we're seeing, there are so many tactics that actually fit within this particular category that it was really hard for us to drill down and even pick just a few. Just a few that we're going to include the attempt to reverse the bathroom laws that protect transgender and gender non-conforming individuals, the attempt to defund Planned Parenthood, and again, the ban on refugees, specifically the ban on any refugees coming from Muslim majority countries. And so much of the narrative around those bans is that we can't have people coming into this country who don't believe the same things that we believe. There's an enormous amount of not just ignorance and assumption in that, but again, like one of the things that we want to continue to try to reframe in these conversations is that we cannot continue ascribing ignorance to their thinking, right? That it's actually ultimately not about how ignorant they are about these other cultural groups or other communities, that it's extremely strategic what they're saying. And then quickly, this final strategy that we want to uplift is bolstering the power of state agents. One of the narratives that's being used to advance this strategy, which we will actually do some deeper work around in the next section, is this narrative of law and order, that right now we're in this chaos in society and we need to return to a law and order mentality, and we need to return to a mentality in which police are respected. Some of the particular tactics that we're witnessing include attempts to legalize the harm and killing of protesters. We're seeing that a lot at the local and county level, that these attempts to pass ordinances that either make it legal to harm protesters, or one of the things that we're seeing a lot in Minnesota is these attempts to make it legal to hold protesters financially liable for the cost of protecting them while they're protesting. So that's a few strategies, or a few specific tactics. Others include the expansion of ICE, significant expansion of ICE and border control. And then we're also seeing an expansion of the policing of communities and terrorizing of people's communities. Does anyone want to add anything, Jenna, Mark, or Manju, to that?
Maybe I'm just appreciating, Manju, I see that you put these strategies together for us in the chat box, and kind of looking at them together, I think adds this other layer of nuance, because what we're trying to do is break them apart, and then we get something back when we braid them back together. And so I guess I'm finding that useful, and I'm thinking about, Autumn, when you were speaking about the kind of dual counter-narrative of equating right-wing Christianity with America as religious freedom versus Islam as the enemy of freedom, that we also see this piece here around that first strategy of white nationalism and racialization that's coming with that. And so something we're hearing, right, is in addition to the term Islamophobia, also the term Islamo-racism, because the ways in which violence, policing, and murder towards people who are Muslim or perceived to be Muslim is actually now not associated with a religious belief or spiritual practice. It's associated with perceived race and skin color, right? And so while those things are moving together, they're supporting one another to advance each other. So like all systems of oppression and that intersectionality piece, we actually see these things relying upon one another for strength. So it's helpful seeing those together for me.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jenna.
May I add that I think there's also an important piece about how often in political moments where the system is using strategies like this that are repressive on many fronts, that are fascist in these ways, that progressive movements will often drift rightward and try and fight the fight on the most moderate ground possible in order to and we start accepting the system's narrative as the frame, and we would argue that part of why we need to understand exactly what the system is up to and its bigger picture is so that we can actually be creating a counter narrative and holding to it, creating a left pole.
Exactly. And actually, when we get into looking at the stages of movement building later, we'll have a really great example of some of where our our social movements are creating these powerful counter narratives because of a really deep education and understanding of exactly these strategies. So stay tuned for that. All right.
So as
quickly to recap.
Systems of oppression that target our communities are constantly changing shape, strategy, and tactic. But we too are resilient and are able to generate brilliance. Our collective capacity for understanding the systemic harm is also always changing. And so as we build our resistance, we've got to challenge and build our political analysis and approach in an ongoing spirit that balances responsiveness with emergence and generation. This is an image that we borrowed from an incredible movement photographer named Brooke Anderson, who's documented this action in the Bay Area.
Thanks. I should talk about this part. Cool. So Project South, which is an amazing organization that has used popular education tools, techniques as an organizing tool to build up skilled leadership, challenging racism and poverty at its roots for over 25 years. Generated this really beautiful, it's like a poster pullout. We can share the full tool with you later on. And so something that's useful and important of why we want to understand these narratives and these strategies and tactics that we're seeing from the state and power holders is because it gives us information, and it gives us information about how to understand and how to anticipate the ways that the state is going to restructure itself to try and suffocate our movements, right? And these narratives are important because as story creators and movement builders, we're always in a conversation with the narratives and action that the state and the power holders we're in opposition against are offering us. So what we have here is an interesting tool, and there's a couple slide version of it. What we're going to look at is Project South is examining a couple different historic moments of collective action and seeing this beautiful uptick. The narratives that these movements are tapping into, the things that they're revealing, and how it leads to further strategic opportunities. The next set of slides looks at the way the state then reorganizes itself in response to those wins to create new challenges that our movements for liberation have to reckon with. And so we're going to look at two different historic moments to understand more clearly how this tool works. And I'll try and move with a fast pace and precision because these are likely examples that many of us are familiar with, but they help kind of experiment with this tool. And you can look at it more closely afterwards. So the first example we're looking at here is SNCC from the years 1960 and 1965, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the best known and most powerful youth organizations that fought for anti-racism, Black liberation, and civil rights. And the first big moment here is that we're talking about is reality exposed, right? The way that an event and the movement more publicly identifies with the population and with itself an important reality about the system it's working within. And so one of the most important things about the historic lunch counter sit-ins that we saw was what surprised many in the movement was how violent the state responded, as well as racist counter-protesters to those lunch counter protests. And that became very clear to folks in the civil rights movement that the federal government was not going to be an ally and was complicit in upholding racist practices and cultures. And there definitely were people who were like, the federal government will be our ally here. And this really was an important moment where the reality that they were not was clearly exposed. So that led us a little bit further along. This is called Forces Are Emboldened, and more room for new organizing takes place. The sit-in movement that started at the lunch counter sit-ins, the lunch counter protests and sit-ins, really spread. And other forms of nonviolent direct action were emboldened. And we see other organizations, other programs and projects that really spread, specifically the Freedom Rides, which were very important. So more and more things and people and projects are getting involved, getting plugged in, popping off. And then that leads us to victories and strategic opportunities that didn't exist if we go back to before those lunch counter sit-ins started. And there's many moments and wins and opportunities that we see around the time of 1965. The creation of SNCC comes out of this moment, and there's many strategies that are employed, targeting voting rights specifically as a lead strategy that really pushed and broke the back of Jim Crow. So our win, right, is that legal segregation was defeated. So then if we go to the next piece of this tool, we need to understand what was the state seeing, what was the state doing, and how are they reorganizing themselves to respond to the success of this. We have a few different categories of reorganization and reconfiguring. The first is around the way that the police state reorganizes itself. And this is really relevant to one of the strategies we spoke about earlier, that in 1968, Nixon runs successfully on a law and order campaign, looking to expand police and the control of police. Right? There are other ways that the police played a role here. Drugs and guns purposefully appear in poor and working class communities, specifically Black communities, as a way of undermining the success, the solidarity, the community, and creating more legal punishment towards specifically Black communities that have seen success in the civil rights movement. So connected to the police state reorganizing, we have the economy, and those of course are functioning with each other. And one example of how the economy reconfigures here is that it shifts to allow a pretty small segment of Black communities to enter into a middle class community. We also see the ways that many Black teachers were fired and replaced with white teachers. This had an economic impact on a whole set of workers, right? As teachers were fired. And it also intervened and changed the ways that Black communities were being taught, having control over their education and curriculum, and were having access points to education, knowledge, and jobs in the future. And then I love this last column that Project South has created because it offers a couple gems of internal conflict, the ways that our movements lacked certain attention to dynamics that were then used to really wedge apart potential successes. We talked about that a lot in the first webinar. We're zooming in on divide and conquer. But here, there were ways that the white members of SNCC were called to really separate and organize among white Southerners. And that happened in some spaces, and in other spaces that call was not met. There are ways that because the role of women and the importance of gender liberation were discounted and